Good morning. Today we will discuss all about the linguistic sexism and feminist linguistic activism. The objectives of this discussion are to raise awareness on gender bias, to understand women and men as regulators, to provide critical relation and language reform, and lastly, to assess feminist language planning and language change. And these are the topics. Number one, women and men as language users and regulators. Number two, feminist linguistic activism, non-sexist language reform. 2.1, feminist sexist language campaigns and instant of language planning. 2.2, documenting sexist language practices. 2.3, changing language how. 2.4, choosing non-sexist alternative. 2.5, implementing changes guidelines for non-sexist language. 2.6, assessing feminist language planning. 2.7, increase awareness on gender bias. 2.8, adopting feminist language change. 2.9, non-sexist generic nouns and pronouns in writing. 2.10, naming practices and titles. And lastly, are the changes effective? Let's start with the women and men as language users and regulators. As we all know, the portrayal of men and women as language users has stressed their fundamental differences. A quick perusal of some writings about male and female speakers across languages leaves no doubt that men are perceived not only as powerful speakers but especially as authoritative language users. Women, on the other hand, are often seen as garrulous, frivolous, and illiterate language users. This popular stereotype gained in stature when they were endorsed by or invalidated in the academic and scientific literature of the day. This scientific validation in turn led to the start of the codification and regular of women's speech and women as speakers, as well as other scholars of language and gender have documented many rules, codes, and guides that were developed to codify and control the women language behavior over the past centuries. And essentially, this action cemented men's status as norm makers, language regulators, and language planners. On the other hand, men signaled their authority in language through their roles in the dictionary-making process, in the writing of normative grammars, in the establishment of language academies, and other normative language institutions, and through their involvement in language planning activities. This explains that women were given some authority in language regulation as a norm enforces, both as mother and as school teachers. Especially, women were to ensure that children learn to use language according to the prescribed norms. But in the recent history, women as language regulator is very different. As stated above mentioned, women were subjected to linguistic regulation much more than men. It was linguistic activism associated with the women's movement starting in the 1970s that posed the first major female challenge to male dominance in language regulation and planning. This explains that women of all walks of life started to expose the biased portrayal of the sexes in language use and demonstrated that this portrayal was particularly discriminatory and damaging to women. Instance, Bodin's 1975 paper on androcentrism and perspective grammar showed that sex indefinitely gained its dominant status generic pronoun as a result of female regulation. Barnes' 1986 comprehensive analysis of grammar in relation to gender similarly exposed androcentric practices. This is another powerful expression of language regulation in the dictionary, that female authors or women-oriented publications, especially women's magazines, were seldom included in the source materials. This exposure of bias cast women in the role of critical commentators on men rules. Perhaps the most threatening to men's rules or norm makers were the attempts of women made at becoming normal makers themselves through the formulation of proposal and guidelines for non-sexist use. Developing women norms and implementing them across the speech community is clearly the strongest challenge, if not threat, to male authority in language regulation. This assumption is borne out by often vehement reaction expressed by male-dominated language academies and other linguistic authorities against analysis of linguistic sexism and against proposal for non-sexist language use. Therefore, it will examine the activities which were triggered by the newly gained female consciousness associated with women's movement across the Western during the 1970s and 1980s, and also the extent of which their attempts at becoming normal makers have been successfully.
Feminist linguistic activism, non-sexist language reform. And now we have feminist non-sexist language campaigns as an instance of language planning. It is important to acknowledge that the debates, actions, and initiatives around the non-sexist language issue are a form of language planning. The marginalization of feminist perspectives on gender and communication in the 1970s and early 1980s had a particularly strong effect on the recognition of feminist linguistics activism as a genuine case of language planning, in this instance of a form of corpus planning. Within this framework, the language planning process is divided into four main stages, which is the fact-finding, the planning stage, implementation stage, and evaluation feedback stage. First, we have the fact finding. The fact finding stage is concerned with documenting the problematic issues and concerns, which is important in part of language planning. And the planning stage focuses on the viability of change as well as on developing proposals for change. In the implementation stage, the methods and venues for promoting and implementing the changes are assessed and the preferred proposals are implemented. In the evaluation feedback stage, language planners seek to assess to what extent the planning and implementation processes have been successful in terms of achieving the goal of the language planning exercise. Sexist language practices. When we say sexist language, it refers to words and phrases that demean, ignore, or stereotype members or either sex or that needlessly call attention to gender. It's a form of biased language. Exposing and documenting sexist practices in language use and communication has been and continues to be a grassroots based activity by feminists with an interest in language and the linguistic representation of the sexes. There is no denying that feminist activists in the USA were the trailblazers in both exposing sexist bias and proposing changes. In the works of Lakoff and Spender and the collection of essays in Nelson became the main reference points for elaborate descriptions of linguistic sexism as it affected the English language. There are a lot of countries in which feminists took an early and active interest in exposing sexist linguistic practices, such as Norway, France, Germany, etc. An example of this practice is found in German where the word Hebam midwife is making way for the new word Entbindungspfleger, literally birthing assistant, as a result of men taking up the role of midwife. Meanwhile, a female midwife has been coined Entbindungspfleger in, a form derived from Entbindungspfleger. And now let's proceed to changing language. How? How the language change. Most feminist language activists were and are proponents of language change as a measure for achieving a more balanced representation of women and men in language. Taking linguistic action to improve the plight of women was seen as an integral part of women's liberation. Furthermore, many language activists subscribe to an interactionist view of language and reality which has its origins in a weaker version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Language shapes and reflects social reality. Planners whose motivation to change is driven by a belief that language change lags behind social change will adapt different strategies from those activists whose main concern is to expose patriarchal bias in language. For example, a linguist's suggestions for change may be heavily influenced by his or her training in recognizing the distinctive structural elements and properties of language, such as phonemes, morphemes, and grammatical categories, and in recognizing how these elements contribute to creating meaning. Among this multitude of opinions and views of the questions of change, three main motivations for change can be discerned. Number one, a desire to expose the sexist nature of the current language system. A desire to create a language which can express reality from a woman's perspective, or a desire to amend the present language system to achieve a symmetrical and equitable representation of women and men. Using linguistic disruption is a strategy favored by those wishing to expose the sexist. nature of the represent language system. Its advocates claim that this strategy helps people to become aware of this many subtle and not so subtle ways in which the women and the female are discriminated against in language. And now we have choosing non-sexist alternatives. One of the most successful and enduring changes affected by women's liberation movement of the 60s through 80s was the universal adoption of non-sexist language by governmental, business, and educational institutions. Social and linguistic factors play a role in the selection of the strategies. Social factors revolve around questions of social effectiveness. The chosen strategy should achieve linguistic equality of the sexes by both affecting and reflecting social change relating to women and men in society. This is particularly relevant with regard to occupational nomenclature. Linguistic factors focus on the issue of linguistic viability as well as on matters of language typology. Proposed changes need to take account of the typological features and the structural properties of a language. For example, languages which mark gender through morphological processes may have different options from those that don't. Linguistic viability is also linked to linguistic prescriptivism. Proposed alternatives which are seen to violate deeply ingrained prescriptive rules or norms could obstruct or slow down the process of adoption in the community. Most non-sexist language proposals generated for a range of languages contain explicit or implicit evidence that these social and linguistic factors have played a role in the choice of the principal strategy. However, feminist activists and language planners proposing changes for the same language may differ in the priority they assign to arguments of social effectiveness and of linguistic viability, or how they interpret these concepts. This had led to debates about the preferred principal strategy. The Dutch and German feminist language debates are examples of the tensions about the choice of the main strategy for language change. Dutch and German are typologically closely related languages with a grammatical gender system. Languages with a grammatical gender system classify nouns into gender categories on the basis of morphological or phonological features. Whilst many have claimed that the grammatical gender system which classifies nouns in the masculine, feminine, or neuter categories is a purely linguistic invention and is not linked to the extra-linguistic category of biological sex. Acknowledge that there is no purely morphological system and that such system always have a semantic core. This is particularly obvious in the gender assignment of human nouns, with most nouns referring to women being feminine and those referring to male persons being masculine. For example, both masculine and feminine nouns attract the same. This gender system is labeled common gender. In the case of human agent nouns, grammatical gender largely coincides with biological sex. The grammatical gender assignment of human agent nouns similarly displays substantial overlap with biological sex. A less radical version of the feminization strategy involves the explicit and consistent use of the feminine forms in gender-specific as well as generic context. In generic context, preference goes to the use of gender-paired formulations, such as der or die, der, in, or der, ler, and die. Learn or the grammatically innovative der, die, learn. This proposal is seen as a linguistically viable option since the German language system is suited for continued formation of feminine, occupational, and human agent nouns through gender suffixation. Unlike Dutch, German has a dominant feminine suffix which continues to be productive. The in suffix I mean the in suffix. There is minimal speaker uncertainty in creating new feminine forms as speakers are not faced with making a selection from a wide variety of options. Concerns about the semantic ambiguity of in are downplayed, as the meaning wife of a male incumbent of an occupation, rather than female incumbent of is disappearing fast. To continue our discussion, now let's proceed to implementing changes, guidelines for non-sexist language use. A crucial component in language planning is the implementation of the proposed changes. Language planners need to identify pathways and mechanisms to implement their proposals so that this can reach and spread through the speech community. The promotion of linguistic disruption and of a newly created woman-centered language was primarily achieved through personal language patterns, often in speech but mainly in writing. Prominent feminist activists who practiced form of linguistic disruptions became role models for and of feminist linguistic change.
Let's proceed to assessing feminist language planning. The relatively recent nature of feminist language planning activities from the mid-1970s at the earliest, and the scant number of investigations to date which have charted non-sexist language change make comprehensive assessment of success or failure yet impossible. Nevertheless, some comments can be made with regards to evidence or a great community awareness of gender bias in language. The success of feminist language activism needs to be judged ultimately against the goals of it set to achieve. This includes raising awareness of the gender bias in language and getting the speech community to adopt the proposed changes in a matter that promotes gender equality. Furthermore, the finding of recent and current research projects can shed some light on the adoption of patterns of non-sexist proposed changes in the community. Therefore, it needs assessment of feminist language planning. Discuss the increased awareness of gender bias. There is no doubt that the English language communities in some other species communities, mainly European, the awareness of gender bias in language has been raised markedly as a result of feminist language activism. Although many people still disagree with the claim that there is a gender bias in language or refuse to adopt non-sexist language changes, they have nevertheless been made aware of the problematic nature of language in this respect. It includes apologizing for the use of generic key. Some authors now feel compelled to justify the use of generic key in textbooks, or using man compounds as a generic context, or other self-correct generic key constructions of comment about title use and gender stereotypes. There are such comments continue to be made in the precatory method. They nevertheless show awareness of the problem. The community awareness is also evident in surveys in issues as a gender stereotyping, masculine generic key, use in linguistic asymmetries in occupational nouns and terms of address and naming practices. For example, in 1986, 13% of 200 female respondents were not familiar with Miss as an alternative title for women. By 1996, this had decreased to 4% of 300 women, as the study of Powell's 2001. It is possible that this stage to discern whether this awareness has been raised more throughout contact with linguistic disruption strategies or through language guidelines striving for linguistic equality. Now, let's discuss the adapting feminist language change. The question right now, does the change spread from public forums or written discourse to public speech? Which sector of the community leads the change and how does it spread from this group to other groups in the community? The systematic investigation into community adaptation of changes linked to the strategies of linguistic disruption or women language developments. Investigating the adaptation of feminist language change is a much more complex issue. It involves exploring which types of feminist language change are being adapted, changing resulting from the linguistic disruption of men-centered and developments or form replacement proposal. It also requires investigating the process by which these changes spread through a speech community. There is certainly evidence that some feminist publications in English, German, Dutch, French, and Spanish continue to use linguistic disruption as a way of keeping readers aware of gender bias in language. Developing women-centered languages remain a preoccupation to poets and creative writers. To date, most such explorations have focused on the adaptation of spread and non-sexist alternatives for generically used nouns and pronouns and symmetrical naming practices or title use. This is to know the knowledge there have not yet any systematic investigation into community, adaptation of changes linked strategy of the linguistic disruption or women-centered language developments. In fact, the linguistic disruption strategy was not intended to be adopted by the community at a large number. Rather, it was used by the linguistic activists to raise the community awareness, sometimes in a more provocative manner. Therefore, it is a proposal of emerging from the linguistic equality and evolving form replacement have received more attention. Now let's proceed to the non-sexist generic nouns and pronouns in writing. The studies by Cooper 1984, Markovitz 1984, Ehrlich and King 1994, and Powell's 1997, and 2000 among others that concern the adaptation of non-sexist generic nouns and pronoun in English. The corpus study of Cooper's 1984, 500,000 words taken from American newspaper and magazines covering the period of 1971 to 1979, noted a dramatic decline in the use of masculine generic noun, including man, compounds, and some decline in the other use of generic he. Markovitz 1984 and Ehrlich and King 1994 focuses on university documents and reveals that the use of non-sexist alternatives for masculine generic nouns and generic he had increased remarkably. Powell's survey on non-sexist generic nouns and pronouns in 2000 jobs advertisements in Australian newspaper found a very high degree of use such forms. Only 5.4% of all generic nouns, example, 180 different occupational and human agents noun used in the advertisement could be considered sex-inclusive terms. There were few instances of man compound of words, with the exception of chairman and handyman. All man compounds score less than their gender-inclusive counterparts. Therefore, the investigation also showed that the already few female-exclusive terms had been abandoned in favor of gender-neutral ones. For example, there were no air hostesses, only attendants, no salesgirl, saleswoman, or saleslady, only salespersons or salespeople. The study also revealed zero of each generic he in job advertisements. Generic he was replaced mainly by the practice of repeating the generic noun, although there were some instead of he and she. This investigation also reveals some difference in the choice of pronoun, which is more likely linked either to type of speaker or a type of speech genre or both. Educators and academics display a greater use of he or she than other educated speakers, whose preference is more than gender-neutral alternative, singularly they. The observed difference may also reflect the type of speech genre. The first study of Powell's considered mainly parliamentary debates and one-on-one interviews on the radio programs, whereas the second study of Powell's focused on lectures in university or other educational setting. Therefore, that both men and women use non-sexist alternatives more than generic he, it is women, not surprisingly, who lead the adoption. Their combined use of non-sexist alternatives, example of the patterns of 3 and 4 and 5, is 82.34%, whereas that of men of 62%. Another indicator that the non-sexist generic nouns and pronouns in writing, in which that the women leading this change is the most complete absence of generic he among female speakers, whereas men still record 10.16% use in this form. Now let's proceed to the naming practices and titles. Symmetrical use of titles and terms of address for women are the elimination of derogatory and discriminatory naming practices were the goals of feminist linguistic activism. There is some evidence of change in this arena of language use, as well as the increasing number of women adopt naming practices which assert their linguistic independence from men. Therefore, another prominent aspect of feminist linguistic reform concerned naming practices and term of address for women. This also an evident change of women are more likely to keep their premarital name after marriage. There is a growing tendency for another surname to be chosen as the family surname upon the birth of children. Naming practices which is rendered women invisible are starting to disappear. Investigation to date have focused on the introduction and spread of the new title Miss as an term of address for women, on replacing Miss and Mrs. for a discussion of the viability of Miss as a new title for women, as by Powell's of 1998. Although this study revealed an increase in the use of Miss, there is not yet strong evidence as Miss in fact replacing the titles of Mrs. or Miss. Also, this study reveals that an increase in the use of Miss, there is not yet strong evidence that Miss in fact replacing the title of Mrs. or Miss. At this stage, Miss has been added as an option beside Mrs. and Miss, with the later titles unlikely to become obsolete in the near future. As the concluding remark as to men's use of Miss to address women preliminary, evidences from Australia suggests that the few attempts are made by men to use Miss, even though a woman's presence or preference for this form is unknown. And now for the third discussion, are the changes effective? The basis is foremost comments on the effectiveness of this reform is an anecdotal evidence. For instance, there is some evidence that newly created person compounds are not used generically but simply replace woman compounds. Another observation is that some feminist linguistic creation are not used in their intended manner, leading to the duplication of this innovation. Comment that while feminist linguistic innovations such as feminism, sexism, sexual harassment, and date rape. This explains that investigating the effectiveness of the changes is the most important of evaluation of the success or failure of social linguistic reform, that the non-sexist language reform can be considered truthfully successful if there is not only evidence of the adoption of non-sexist alternative, but also evidence that these alternatives are being used in a manner promoting linguistic equality of the sexes. In the study of Kuroshashi 1989, the study, however, revealed no real difference in the mental imagery associated with the masculine generic and gender-inclusive or gender-neutral generic forms, except in the case of women who had reform in their language. This concludes that the adoption of gender-inclusive and gender-neutral will be only effective if there is a personal awareness of the discriminatory nature of the other form and there is a personal commitment to change. And there is also a proof that those who adopt changes because they are aware of the bias and have a personal commitment to change, this ultimately meaning are not fixed and will change over time and according to its context. This applies as much to feminist meaning as to many or other meanings. To sum it up, this discussion about linguistic activism and feminist linguistic activism, that feminist linguistic activism is a genuine form of language reform, showing women in the new rules of critical linguistic commentators, nor breakers, nor makers, even if the ultimate goal of feminist language reform may not be achieved. These linguistic initiatives in action, many of which have been undertaken at the grassroots level, have made a major contribution to expose the ideologization of linguistic meanings to the speech community at a large number, which will be the challenging of hegemony of the meaning promoted and authorized by the dominant group or culture, in this case of men.